After my wife died, a lawyer read her will out loud in a quiet office in Tulsa. My son walked out with a $5 million house. I walked out with a rusted key to a farm I had never even seen. That same night, my son looked me in the eye and told me I had 3 weeks to get out of his life for good. I drove 2 hours into the middle of nowhere, unlocked a farmhouse door that had not been opened in years, and what I found waiting inside changed everything I thought I knew about my wife, my son, and the family I thought I had. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we get into this one, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe if you are new here. I always love reading in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. Quick note before we start. This story blends real inspiration with some details that have been shaped for the sake of the telling. But the heart of it, the love, the betrayal, and the choices people make when money is on the table, that part is as true as anything you will ever hear. My name is Gordon Whitfield, and this is what happened to me the year I turned 68. The conference table felt enormous that morning, wider than any table has any right to be. It stretched between me and my son like a border neither of us wanted to cross. Diane Kessler sat at the head of it, her reading glasses low on her nose, a leather folder open in front of her like a judge about to hand down a sentence. My son Bradley sat across from me with his wife Meredith beside him, both leaning forward the way people lean when they already know they have won something. It had been 7 days since my wife Eleanor died, 7 days of casseroles I never ate, condolences I barely heard, and Bradley pacing the hallway on his phone, while I sat alone by the window watching the driveway. Diane cleared her throat, and the room went still. "Thank you both for coming," she said in that calm, practiced voice lawyers use for exactly these moments. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Grace Whitfield, executed on October the 18th, 2022, 6 months before she passed." I did the math without even trying. 6 months. She had known something was coming long before any of us did. Diane adjusted her glasses and began. "To my beloved son, Bradley James Whitfield." My son sat up straight in his chair, and Meredith reached under the table to squeeze his hand. "I leave the family residence at Brentwood Circle in Southern Hills, appraised at $5.3 million, Diane read. Meredith let out a small gasp. Bradley did not smile, but his eyes lit up with something close to hunger. Diane kept going without pausing for a breath. "Additionally, the investment portfolio through Sterling Wealth Management, current value $6 million, and the full retirement accounts through Larkspur Energy Solutions, valued at $2.5 million, $12 million, all of it going to one man." Then Diane turned the page and my heart started pounding against my ribs, because I knew whatever came next belonged to me, to my husband. "Gordon Whitfield," Diane read. "I leave the family property located in Comanche County, 800 acres including farmhouse and outbuildings. County appraised value $180,000. The room went completely silent. Bradley blinked once, then said, "Wait, what?" Diane looked up calmly and explained that the land had belonged to Eleanor's grandparents since the 1940s. Bradley leaned back in his chair, and I watched his face move through confusion, then calculation, then something close to disgust. "A farm," he said. "That is it. Dad gets a broken-down farmhouse and a pile of dirt." Meredith touched his arm and told him to stop, but he was already laughing, a short, ugly sound with no warmth in it at all. "Mom left him a shack," he said, shaking his head. "Dad cannot even manage a farm. He taught high school history for 40 years. That land is worthless." Diane told him the will was extremely clear and that his mother had been very specific about the entire distribution. Bradley demanded to know why. Eleanor had never once mentioned this farm to him in his entire life. Diane slid an envelope across the table toward me, thick and cream-colored, my name written across the front in Eleanor's unmistakable slanted handwriting. "Gordon, open at the farm, trust me." Bradley pushed his chair back and stood, saying he was calling a lawyer immediately. Diane told him that was certainly his right, but that his mother's estate had been drafted by one of the most respected attorneys in the state, and that contesting it would cost him a fortune and change absolutely nothing. Bradley turned to me instead. "Dad," he said, "you are not actually going to accept this, are you?" My voice came out cracked and quiet. "Your mother wanted me to have the farm." He repeated the word farm like it tasted bad in his mouth, then said, "You are 68 years old. What exactly do you think you are going to do out there in the middle of nowhere? I told him I had not even seen it yet. Meredith stood and gently suggested they leave and let me process everything. Bradley grabbed his coat, and at the door he turned back one last time. "Enjoy your farm, Dad," he said. "Do not come crying to me when you realize Mom left you nothing but a tax bill." Then the door slammed and the room went quiet again. Diane took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "I'm sorry you had to sit through that," I told her. She sighed and said she had seen worse. Then she looked at me with something close to sympathy in her eyes and told me my wife had loved me very much and had been extremely deliberate about every single detail in that plan for over a year. I asked her why Eleanor would want me to open a letter only after I reached the farm instead of just handing it to me right there. Diane said Eleanor wanted me to see something with my own eyes first. Then she reached into her folder and placed an old rusted key on the table in front of me. "This opens the farmhouse," she said. "Comanche County, about 2 hours west. If you have questions later, call me anytime." I thanked her quietly and left, and the key felt heavier in my hand than any key had a right to feel. That night I drove back to the house that was no longer mine, the same house where Eleanor and I had lived for 18 years, the same bedroom where she died holding my hand and whispering something I still did not understand. "Trust the farm, Gordon," she had said. "Everything you need is there." Around 8 that evening, Bradley walked into the guest room without knocking, holding a folder. "We need to talk," he said flatly and handed it to me. An eviction notice. 22 days to vacate the property. "This is my house now," I told him. "Jessica and I are starting a family," he said. "We need the space and you have got the farm. Go live there." As he walked out, he added one more thing over his shoulder. "Do not take anything valuable. I already made an inventory. The silver, the artwork, your mother's jewelry, all of it belongs to me now." I sat alone in that guest room holding an eviction notice in one hand and a rusted key in the other, listening to my son laugh on the phone somewhere down the hall. 22 days to leave the only home I had known for 18 years. 22 days to figure out why. The woman I had loved for 40 years had left me 800 acres in the middle of nowhere, instead of a single dollar of the fortune she built. The roar of diesel engines woke me at 6 the next morning. 3 contractor trucks filled the driveway, men in hard hats unloading crowbars and power drills. Bradley stood on the porch in a suit sipping coffee, pointing workers toward Eleanor's old office. I ran downstairs in yesterday's clothes just in time to watch a man unscrewing the brass nameplate off her office door, watching another toss her books into black trash bags by the armful. "Those are her books," I said. Bradley told me the renovation crew was on a schedule, and I should let them work. A worker lifted a framed photograph off her desk, the ribbon cutting from her very first oil office back in 1997. Eleanor in a white hard hat, grinning like she had just conquered the world. Me standing beside her, clapping like the proud husband I was. I asked if I could keep the photo. Bradley said the frame alone was worth $1,800, and told the man to toss the whole thing in the dumpster. I retreated upstairs while the drills echoed through the house like distant thunder, and I sat on the edge of a narrow guest bed with 21 days left before I had to leave the only home I had known for nearly 2 decades. I pulled out my wallet and found the one photo I had made sure to grab. Eleanor and me on our wedding day back in 1983, married at the courthouse with 2 witnesses and a weekend honeymoon we could barely afford. I was a young history teacher making $26,000 a year. She was fresh out of graduate school with a geology degree and a job offer from an oil company nobody had ever heard of. 2 years later, Bradley was born, and while I stayed home teaching summer school, Eleanor went back to work after 3 months because sitting still made her restless in a way I never understood, but never resented either. In 1995, Eleanor started her own company, Larkspur Energy Solutions, sitting at our kitchen table telling me she knew this industry cold. She was right. By the year 2000, she was a millionaire. By 2005, we had bought the Southern Hills house, though I kept teaching because I loved my classroom more than I ever cared about money. Bradley grew up with private schools and ski trips to Colorado, and somewhere along the way I watched him drift away from us, or maybe just away from me, money fascinating him far more than people ever did. Then, in August of 2021, Eleanor sat me down at that same kitchen table and told me 4 words that changed everything. Stage 3 cancer, I retired the same week. Every hour I had left belonged to her. But even as the treatments drained her strength, she started keeping secrets, unexplained trips to Comanche County, closed-door meetings with Diane Kessler, her office door locked more and more often. When I asked what she was working on, she only said she was tying up loose ends, and I did not push because she was fighting for every breath, and I could not bring myself to add weight to her shoulders. On the 27th of February 2023, Bradley visited her hospice bed for 20 minutes, stepped out for a phone call, and never came back in. That night, Eleanor could barely speak, but she reached for my hand and pulled me close. "Trust the farm," she whispered. "Do not let Bradley take it, promise me." I promised, though I did not understand a word of it. She told me she loved me, that 40 years was not enough, and I told her it was everything. She died the next morning at 64 years old. At the small funeral, Diane Kessler came, a few executives from Larkspur showed up, and one uninvited guest stood silent in the back the entire service. A man named Russell Kane, Eleanor's longtime rival in the oil business. He never approached me, never said a word of condolence, just watched. At the time, I thought it was strange. Grief has a way of making everything feel unreal, so I let it go. Now sitting in that guest room, listening to drills tear apart the office where Eleanor built an empire, I looked down at our wedding photo and whispered that I did not know what she had left me. But I trusted her anyway. 16 days before I had to leave the house for good, I was carrying a cardboard box to my car when Bradley pulled into the driveway, followed by a silver sedan. A thin man in a navy suit stepped out with a leather briefcase under his arm. Bradley introduced him as Dennis Rourke, an elder care planning attorney, and led us both into the dining room where Eleanor and I once celebrated 20 years of anniversaries. Dennis spread documents across the bare table, and the top page read, "General Durable Power of Attorney" in bold capital letters. He explained in a smooth, practiced voice that this would authorize Bradley to manage all my financial affairs, property holdings, and medical decisions as I transitioned into a safer living arrangement. I read the fine print, and one word stopped me cold: irrevocable. Dennis confirmed that yes, once signed, I could never take it back. Further down, a paragraph highlighted in yellow explained that if I were ever deemed unable to manage my own affairs, Bradley could petition the court for full guardianship without any prior notice to me at all. I looked up and asked Bradley directly if he wanted control of everything, including the farm. He told me the county had filed a tax lien, $15,000 in unpaid property taxes, and that if I signed this document, he would handle it, all of it, so I would never have to worry about a single bill again. I asked what would happen if I refused. Dennis explained that under Oklahoma law, given my age, my recent loss, and my lack of stable income, a judge would very likely grant Bradley temporary control of my assets within 72 hours. For one long moment I saw him the way he used to be, 8 years old, crying at the kitchen sink because his goldfish had stopped moving. But that boy was gone, and the man across from me stared back without a trace of hesitation. I closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and told him to get out. He warned me I had 2 weeks to think it over before he filed the petition. Neither of them waited for a response. The front door slammed, and through the window I watched the silver sedan pull away. 5 days later, I was clearing the last of my things when a manila folder slipped out of the overflowing recycling bin at the curb. Meredith's looping handwriting on the tab reading, "Dad, residential options." Inside were glossy brochures for a place called Fairview Manor in Guthrie, Oklahoma, a low brick building surrounded by dead brown grass, photos of a dining hall under fluorescent lights, and residents sitting silently in wheelchairs. Underneath was a signed contract. Resident name Gordon Whitfield. Shared occupancy. Monthly rate $2,800. A security deposit $5,600 non-refundable. Move-in date April the 20th. Authorized by Bradley Whitfield, power of attorney. Then I saw the date printed at the bottom of the contract. January the 28th, 1 month before Eleanor died. While she was upstairs fighting for every breath, my son had already signed the paperwork to send me away. My hands were shaking as I searched the facility online and found review after review. A father left in a soiled bed for 6 hours while staff ignored the call button. A mother who lost 12 pounds in 2 months while management insisted she was simply adjusting, a wedding ring that vanished from a residence room with no investigation ever opened. I photographed every page of that folder and hid it beneath a blanket in my truck. 11 days left, and my son had planned every part of this while his own mother was still alive to see it happen. 2 days before the deadline, a thick envelope arrived from the Comanche County tax assessor. Notice of delinquent property tax, $18,577 due. Deadline the 21st of May, or the property would be sold at public auction. My teacher's pension paid $2,100 a month, and even if I stopped buying groceries entirely, I could never cover that bill. When I showed it to Bradley, he barely glanced at it before offering to buy the whole farm off me for $50,000 cash, calling it a family favor, warning me that after the deadline, the county would auction the land and I would get nothing at all. That night, Diane Kessler called and told me Bradley had already phoned her office asking her to waive the lien, and that she had refused because Eleanor's instructions were crystal clear. The farm belonged to me and only me. She told me 18 months earlier, Eleanor had placed the farm inside an irrevocable trust titled entirely in my name, a trust no power of attorney could touch, no probate court could seize, and no creditor could ever claim. Legally, she said, Bradley has no authority over that land whatsoever, and he knows something you do not. She told me Eleanor had already filed a tax extension that morning, giving me until the end of June to settle the lien, and she made me promise not to sign anything. Not the power of attorney, not any sale, nothing at all. 2 more days, she said, and you will finally understand everything. The next morning I drove to her office and she handed me a second sealed envelope, telling me Eleanor had asked her to remind me of 3 things. First, that the farm was protected. Second, that I had more resources than I realized. And third, a message Eleanor had asked her to deliver word for word. Tell him I'm still looking out for him even now. I left her office holding that envelope against my chest, my mind spinning through every strange thing Eleanor had said in her final months. That afternoon a bulldozer showed up in the backyard and tore straight through Eleanor's rose garden while Bradley stood by with a clipboard talking about a pool he wanted installed. 20 years of careful planting ripped up in seconds, except for one bush still standing untouched at the far edge. A yellow rose Eleanor had planted on our 25th wedding anniversary because yellow was the color she wore the day we first met. I dropped to my knees and dug it out with my bare hands, while Bradley shouted that I could not take it. And I did not answer him, I just carried it to my truck, wrapped the roots in an old tarp, and drove away without looking back. That night I lay awake on an old cot inside the farmhouse when my phone buzzed with a text from Bradley renewing his $50,000 offer. 10 minutes later he called, and something told me to answer and mute my end immediately. He did not know I was listening. I heard him tell someone that the tax lien was only $18,000, but that if I figured out what was actually under that land before he got my signature, they would lose all their leverage. Drilling rights, he said, the whole section. He mentioned a guardianship petition ready to file, a place in Guthrie waiting for me, and once he had control as conservator, the land would finally be theirs. He laughed, calling me a retired teacher who had no idea what he was sitting on, and told whoever was on the other end that if I did not sell by Friday, they would go to court. I sat frozen in the dark, my own recording app still running on the phone in my hand. My son was not offering me money out of kindness. He was trying to steal something buried beneath my own land, something worth far more than he would ever admit to my face. The morning I finally had to leave the house for good, Bradley was waiting on the porch holding a folded check. $25,000, half of what he had offered 2 days earlier. Cash it today and walk away clean, he said. I took the check, tore it into 4 pieces, and handed the scraps back to him without a word. He told me I was making a mistake. I picked up my duffel bag and drove 2 hours west, past strip malls and grain elevators, and hand-painted signs advertising fresh eggs, until the road narrowed into wheat fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. A mailbox reading Whitfield in fading black letters marked the gravel drive, and at the end of it sat a small weathered farmhouse with a sagging porch, and behind it a massive red barn leaning slightly to one side. I parked, stepped out into total silence, no traffic, no bulldozers, just wind moving through the wheat. I planted the yellow rose in a whiskey barrel on the porch, then sat down on the steps and stared out at 800 empty acres that most people would drive right past without a second glance. Inside, on a small card table, sat 2 envelopes waiting for me, one sealed with red wax from the will reading, the other from Diane's office, my name written across both in Eleanor's careful, slanted handwriting. I broke the first seal with trembling hands. The letter told me that by the time I read it, I should already be standing at the farm, and that some truths were safer written down than spoken aloud. It told me to go to the barn, find the attic access hidden behind the hay bales in the northwest corner, and use the rusted key to open a trunk waiting there, because everything I needed was inside. "I love you," she had written. "I always have." I found the ladder exactly where she described, climbed into a low, dusty attic, and behind a stack of hay bales I found an old military-style trunk with a thick brass padlock. The rusted key turned with a heavy click. Inside were 4 folders stacked neatly, each labeled in Eleanor's handwriting. Geological Survey, Bradley marked in red, Russell Kane Conspiracy marked in blue, Trust Documents. On top rested another letter, and my hands shook as I opened it. Eleanor wrote that Bradley had stolen $370,000 from us over the past 18 months, forging her signature, moving money through shell accounts, lying repeatedly to their accountant, and that she had never confronted him, choosing instead to document everything quietly, while she still had strength left to fight. She wrote that Bradley had been working with Russell Kane since the fall of 2021 to force me into a nursing facility, seize the farm through a fraudulent guardianship petition, and then sell the mineral rights out from under me entirely. She wrote that the land sat directly above a massive shale oil formation worth an estimated $25 million, that she had already negotiated a partnership with her own company, Larkspur Energy, where I would retain 75% of all net royalties, somewhere between $2 and $3 million a year. She explained the trust could never be touched by any power of attorney or guardianship order, and that a hidden ethics clause meant if Bradley ever contested the will or dealt with Russell Kane in any way, he would forfeit his entire $12 million inheritance and face federal prosecution. She told me Diane had copies of everything, that the evidence would protect me, and that I needed to stop trying to see the boy Bradley used to be, because he had made his choices long ago, and it was time to protect myself instead of him. I opened the red folder and found a full timeline in Eleanor's handwriting, dates and dollar amounts stretching back over a year, forged signatures on withdrawal slips, a surveillance photo from a bank teller window, a fraudulent hardship claim filed only 3 days after her cancer diagnosis. Beneath it, a note in her hand read, "Discovered in September, monitored for 6 months, documented everything, let him think he got away with it, set the trap." My stomach turned as I realized my own son had drained our accounts while I was helping his mother to the bathroom at night, reading to her from her favorite books, having no idea he was stealing from her at the very same time. The blue folder held printed email chains between Bradley and Russell Kane, going back to the fall of 2021, Kane reaching out first about the untapped reserves under our land, Bradley admitting his own parents had no idea what it was worth, a $50,000 wire transfer labeled consulting services as the first payment for my son's betrayal. There was a stolen geological survey report, a draft sale contract offering me $500,000 for land containing $25 million in oil, while surrendering every mineral right forever, and a final email from Kane instructing Bradley to use whatever leverage necessary. Guardianship, the nursing facility, financial pressure, in exchange for $5 million cash and a vice president title at Kane's company. Bradley had replied the very same day, agreeing to the entire plan, already naming the facility in Guthrie where he intended to send me. I sat in that dusty attic for a long time, with the evidence of my own son's betrayal spread across my lap, understanding for the first time that Eleanor had fought a private war for 2 years, while I sat beside her bed with no idea any of it was happening. That evening, 3 knocks sounded on the farmhouse door, and I opened it to find an old man named Frank Delaney, who ran the gas station a few miles east and had been quietly watching over the farm for Eleanor the entire time. He brought coffee, a sandwich, a battery-powered lantern since the property had no electricity, and an envelope containing $20,000 in cash that Eleanor had left with him months earlier. He warned me that Bradley and Russell Kane had already been asking questions around the county about mineral rights, that they were circling, and he told me not to sign a single thing they put in front of me. Before he left, he mentioned one more hiding spot, a metal box in the attic marked insurance, tucked behind the fiberglass insulation. Inside that box, I found photocopies of everything already in the trunk, plus a small flash drive labeled evidence, FBI copy, and a business card for a federal agent named Renee Castillo. Eleanor had been feeding evidence to the FBI the entire time she was dying, and I had never known a single word of it. 2 days later, tires crunched over gravel outside, and I looked out to see a black sedan and a silver SUV pulling into the yard. Bradley stepped out first in a suit and sunglasses, followed by Russell Kane himself, grey-haired and confident, the kind of man used to giving orders his whole life. Kane extended his hand and offered me $10 million cash on the spot to sign over the deed that day, calling it a solution to all my stress. I asked Bradley if he had brought this man here, and when he stammered something about it being a fair offer, I pulled out my phone and played the recording from 2 nights earlier. Bradley's own voice filling the morning air, drilling rights, the whole section, the guardianship petition, the facility in Guthrie. Taking control as conservator once I was locked away, Kane went pale. Bradley went paler. I told them the recording was 2 nights old and that Bradley had not realized I was standing in the hallway when he made that call. Bradley snapped that the oil under this place was worth more than I could ever imagine, then froze the second the words left his mouth, because he had just confirmed everything I already knew. That was when another vehicle rolled up the drive, Diane Kessler stepping out with her briefcase, followed by Patrick Owens, the CEO of Larkspur Energy, my late wife's own company. Diane handed Russell Kane a cease and desist order, naming him specifically as a prohibited party under the trust, warning that any further contact would trigger immediate legal action. She handed Bradley a second document explaining that any guardianship attempt, any deal with Kane, any interference at all would strip him instantly of his entire $12 million inheritance. Patrick Owens stepped forward and told me Eleanor had finalized a drilling partnership with him 6 months earlier, that operations would begin within 60 days, and that I would retain 75% of every dollar in net royalties, an arrangement almost unheard of in the industry. He told Russell Kane that Larkspur had already filed the lease applications and that Kane's competing filings had just been denied by the state. Kane turned on Bradley and told him he thought this was handled, then climbed into his car and drove away without another word. Bradley stood in the dirt holding papers that trembled in his hands, looking at me like he might finally say something real for the first time in years, but no words ever came. He folded the papers, got into his sedan and disappeared down the gravel road, and I did not look back either. Within days, Bradley emailed Diane threatening a probate challenge and a new guardianship petition, calling my living conditions elder neglect. Diane explained to me that the trust contained an ethics clause so airtight that any legal challenge from Bradley would instantly forfeit his entire inheritance and hand every piece of evidence directly to the FBI, exposing him to 5 to 10 years in federal prison for wire fraud. She sent him a 48-hour warning. 2 days later, she called to tell me it was over. Bradley's lawyer had formally withdrawn every single petition, accepting the terms of the trust completely rather than risk prison. Bradley sent one final email, calling it a clean break and asking me never to contact him again. I wrote back one time, telling him exactly what he had done to his own dying mother. And then I blocked his number for good. Weeks later, Russell Kane was arrested at his own headquarters by federal agents, charged with wire fraud, conspiracy, and industrial espionage, based on evidence Eleanor had been quietly supplying to the FBI as a confidential informant for the final year and a half of her life without ever telling me a word of it. Bradley was offered immunity in exchange for testimony against Kane, losing his accounting license and his reputation, but avoiding prison entirely, which was exactly the kind of ending that fit the son he had become. Agent Renee Castillo told me my wife had been one of the most dedicated informants she had ever worked with, documenting every wire transfer and every meeting for 20 months straight, even after her diagnosis, the following May, Drilling crews arrived and raised the first derrick on the exact spot Eleanor had circled on a survey months before she died. By midsummer, oil was flowing at over 1,000 barrels a day, and by autumn the first royalty check arrived in the mail for nearly $3 million for a single quarter. I sat at that same card table and stared at the number for 20 minutes before I could even bring myself to move. I called Diane and asked what I was supposed to do with money like that, and she asked what I wanted to do with it, and I told her I wanted to do exactly what Eleanor would have done. Together we built the Eleanor Whitfield Foundation on 3 simple pillars: scholarships for local students who could not afford college, no-interest grants for small businesses that promised to hire locally, and financial support for families facing the same cancer costs that had nearly buried us both. At the first scholarship ceremony the following spring, 50 students walked across a stage to receive $5,000 each, and a young woman named Grace Sullivan told me through tears that she wanted to study petroleum engineering, just like Eleanor once had. I told her not to try to be like me, but to be like her instead. 3 years later, I still wake at 6 every morning and walk out to a rose garden with 50 bushes planted in careful rows around a bench with a brass plaque that reads simply, Eleanor's Garden. The oil field brings in $7.5 million a year, and every dollar beyond what I need to live modestly flows straight into the foundation that carries her name. Bradley burned through nearly all of his $12 million within 2 years on failed investments and bad bets, and last I heard, he was selling used cars in Phoenix alone. Russell Kane is serving 15 years in federal prison. I feel no anger toward either of them anymore, only a strange kind of gratitude, because they showed me clearly, without ever meaning to, exactly who I never wanted to become. If you ask me what this whole experience taught me, I always give the same answer. Do not wait for a crisis to show you who the people around you really are. My wife spent the last 2 years of her life quietly building a wall around me when I did not even know I needed protecting, and in the end, that wall was not built out of anger, it was built out of love. What happened to my son was never revenge. It was simply the truth catching up to him on its own schedule. Real strength is not proving someone wrong. It is building something so meaningful that their cruelty eventually fades into the background and stops mattering at all. So if you are watching this tonight and wondering what you would do in my place, finding a hidden future, while facing betrayal from your own child, I would genuinely love to hear your answer in the comments below. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. And one last honest note, this story blends real inspiration with dramatized details for the sake of the telling, but the truth underneath it all remains exactly the same no matter who tells it. Protect what matters most to you, build something that outlives you, and when life hands you betrayal, remember you always get to choose what you build in its place. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight.